I'm Barbara Brackman, and welcome to another episode, number 21 of the Know-It-Alls. And we have a special guest today, Janneken Smucker. And we're going to talk about something she's quite interested in lately, which is the 30s and 40s or the Roosevelt years. And each of us is going to talk about a different aspect from the workshops and the workrooms down to style in the 30s and 40s and fabric shortages. So we're going to begin today with Debby Cooney, who I didn't tell this to, but she's going to talk about a Pennsylvania family and how their quilts changed during the 30s and 40s. And, it'll be fun for us to look at this because Pennsylvanians tend to be conservative quilt makers. And I bet there was a little kicking and screaming. If you can't find fabric, you got to make new quilts. So Debby, you want to start? Share your screen?
All right. Well,
I'm going to put this on.
Here is an array of southeastern Pennsylvania quilts for sale that show the changing popularity of fabrics and patterns in the early to mid 20th century. Here we've got the 9-patch on the left, 1910 to maybe 1920. It's got some pastel fabrics, but it mostly looks like the older palette. And in the center is a steeplechase from, I don't know, 50s or maybe even later than that. And over here on the right is the fans, grandmother's fan, some places, and you can just see a little bit of a star quilt. Those that land definitely probably right in the middle of where we're talking about today in the 30s. Pennsylvania quilt makers were somewhat slow to take up the newly fashionable pastel fabrics, though. Many continued to use the darker colors of the late 19th century, but they did eventually come around. These are Ely and Walker Company prints when they made both solids and prints, and they're found in many of the quilts of the 20th century in Pennsylvania, including those of the Pennsylvania Germans, who were prolific quilt makers. Now, I asked Barb Garrett, the go-to person on Pennsylvania quilts, about some of their choices, and here's what she said. Pennsylvania Germans didn't stop using the Ely and Walker fabrics. Often we can only tell the age of a quilt by looking at the back fabric and assume that it represents the date the quilt was made. It's possible the top was made in 1900, quilted in 1930s, but we have the ages of some makers that indicate that she did both the tops and the quilting in the 1930s. The Ely and Walker color scheme definitely continued up until World War II. And here we have a couple of sample pages from Laurette Carroll's collection, and they have these, and they even have some that really even look like kind of like mourning prints. But we'll be seeing a bunch of those in just a bit. So this is a Franklin County cactus applique quilt, and it's a good example of a holdover of fabrics that I was describing. When you look at it at first, it might be, 1870s, 80s, but these vases are made out of sateen. So that kicks it up into the 20th century, and look at this back. So this one is a real holdover of different kinds of fabrics. These delectable mountains variations seen in Berks County in the third quarter of the 19th century and onward. Here it is, here are two of them in the 1930s, 20s and 30s maybe, in bold, dark sateens on the left and in pink and green on the right. Traditional patterns in Pennsylvania and Maryland continued, even in Maryland, their quilts often just stuck to their favorite patterns, like the Irish chain on the right, and here it is in very subdued colors. And the one on the left shows darker 9-patches with that incongruous 1930s sash and a darker back. So we've really got combinations here. So there you see the contrast really boldly. I have to say, in all the years I've been hunting for quilts at Pennsylvania auctions and sales, I have found very few designed by the era's big names. The heirloom basket quilt here was made by Ella Ream in 1942 in a small coal mining town in West Central Pennsylvania. She was the wife of a 70-year-old laborer in a sawmill, probably happy to have a job at his age. The 1940 census shows the importance of federal programs to this community. Ella's neighbors included 2 young folk working for the National Youth Administration, a laborer working on a WPA road construction project, and another who did reforestation for the Civilian Conservation Corps. And the one on the left, the Dresden, comes from Greensburg, just outside Pittsburgh, and Carrie's husband was a coal miner. I've seen very few Marie Webster design quilts, and I'm bought this one in Pennsylvania, but I'm not sure that it's 1930s. It is sateen, but it's very bold still. It could be just unfaded, but it's one of the very few I've seen, and I love that pattern. The other one is from Fayette County, south of Pittsburgh, on the West Virginia border, where Carrie's husband was a farmer. And I talked to Stella Rubin about this, who told me that she sees very few of the fancy 1930s, especially in the kit quilts, those of swags and the fulsome appliques in Pennsylvania. And she buys a lot of Pennsylvania quilts, but the Pennsylvanians seem to prefer the simpler kits, fewer pieces. Now I'm going to take a look at this one family. Oscar and his wife, Mabel, bought their dry goods probably from the little town of Hanover, just near where they lived, just a few miles west, or York City, just about 20 miles east. They were Pennsylvania Germans. They had 19 children between 1903 and 1930. But the oldest 3 girls, Grace, born in 1905, Helen, born in 1907, and Florence, 1908. Didn't marry, but did produce a lot of quilts in the 1920s and later. They probably learned from and worked with their mother, Mabel, who was born in 1885. The family was Lutheran. These quilts turned up in one of their younger brothers' estates and might have been made by the older sisters and the mother and given to him. This one on the left is a little hard to date, but it's the Lemoyne star pattern. Dark colors, nicely sashed and with little substitute stars there. The Rolling Stone is a little later, could be 20s, could be a little bit later, but this here really do look like those Elian Walker fabrics. This quilt, Bud from Mother, this is one of more than 20 of the Moule quilts that were sold together at a different auction a little bit later than the one I showed of Bud's. It's the traditional kind of bear paws fabric pattern in darker colors and surrounded by this nice kind of peach sateen. So this kind of shows me that both mothers and daughters were working together on these quilts. Well, here we have one by Helen. Piece was tagged 1933, and it's another combination of darker blocks with a pastel ground. The pattern seems to be a variant of a couple of Ladies Art Company designs, and the quilting is very finely done and copious, and I kind of made this little sketch up here because I didn't want to forget it. These are pictures, by the way, that I printed out from the auction. It was too long ago for the auction company to have saved them. So I apologize for the quality, but I think you'll see the important parts of it. Here we have Grace's from 1936. She was 31 when she made this Odd Fellows Choice or Wild Goose Chase, also probably from a Ladies Art Company or similar quilt pattern. Like many Pennsylvania German quilts of the 19th century, it radiates color and contains no white. A 12-strand cable similar to that on Helen's quilt is outlined here. Florence, a bear's paw, very much like her mother's. They're surrounded by a pale blue sateen. And over on the right, Helen and Grace made double wedding rings with the same same fabric, excuse me. Helen's is a bit smaller than Grace's, and it was finished in 1938. But so they were obviously not kits, completing kits, because the sizes of the quilts are different, even though the fabrics are the same. These two are unsigned. The blocks on the left resemble the pinwheel pattern of the old Chelsea Station publication in New York. And again, it's got darker blocks and it's sashed and bordered with a pale color. And the same cable quilting enhances the whole as some of the other quilts. The Ladies Art Company album pattern is probably the source for the complex blocks on the right with the yellow background. Well, several rayon tied quilts and spreads appeared at this auction. Improvisational piecing is not uncommon in Pennsylvania, and I bought this one, so the picture's a little better, for its riot of colors. I don't know where the fabrics came from. Maybe there was a local factory, or she might have ordered them through the mail. And Helen was only 38 in 1945 when she pieced this top, but she had it quilted by someone outside the family. Perhaps the sisters' quilt making had slowed down by 1945s. The note reads, "My mixed flower garden quilt has been pieced about 5 years ago now. I had Mrs. Seidenstrickler's quilted in April 1950, paid $6.25 for work, thread, and wadding. Signed by Helen." So that's the Maul's quilt. It's spelled M-O-U-L, but it was originally M-A-U-L, so it's Maul. So how does that sort of fit into what people think?
Wonderful to see that. I can remember when I was a young collector and dealer in the late 60s and 1970s, when I had a shop, we had pickers in Pennsylvania, and I would get those kinds of quilts and didn't know, I just couldn't figure out their age. I didn't know enough about the fabrics, and they looked so much like 19th century quilts. I just couldn't figure it out. But so it's great to see it in this format. It's wonderful.
It is difficult.
Yeah.
It's also good to see the transition where the last one was mainstream.
Yes.
You know, where it could have been made in Milwaukee or LA.
Yep.
So a gradual adaptation.
Yep.
Very interesting.
Debby, will you talk a little bit about Ely Walker and how long they printed fabric and so on?
Well, I'm not a fabric expert. Barb is the expert on that one, but I did look it up, and they started printing around 1900, I think, in St. Louis.
And you know who
and they
the
kept
Walker
going.
is? And George Walker Bush is a descendant of Eli Walker.
Oh, really?
Right. Wow.
See, you guys didn't know that. That's where that's where a lot of the Bush money came from, or Walker money.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
Wow.
It's very interesting, you know.
Yeah.
So
but on her blog,
it was, you know, and you showed the ABC. I have a sample book of that too. That was enormous, that particular company with all those 30s prints, because I know many people, like Lorette has the sample book. I have one, and I know several other people with sample books. They were really out there, and I think they really were kind of influential in changing the style of fabric. You know, and that's modernism. It's better dyes that you can print any color with any other color, as long as you surround it with a little white. Overlapping was tough, but Eli Walker was great at it, and so was the ABC.
And they printed very late, right? They printed into the.
I don't know.
Yeah.
They probably stopped. I used to buy it. I mean, in my memory, I remember buying it. And you know, I worked for Moda, and at one time the boss said, "Let's do an Eli Walker line," and all the 25-year-olds went, "Oh, let's not." But she insisted. Think like a stone. You can go to any thrift store and buy all the Eli Walker look you want.
Well, that's part of what's so confusing, is that they're printing in 1980 some of the same designs as in 1900.
And then you can find mine from Moda if anybody ever bought it.
Yeah, and you have to look really carefully which is what I learned to do, to see the quality of the print and also the shade of the color to start to get a sense of when those fabrics were printed.
That's good. Quality is important because when you look at the ones from 1900, the greens tend to fade, but the ones from 1950, the greens are much better, but they're a little bit different.
Right.
It's tough. I mean, when someone's in business and printing their bread and butters, as they used to call them, over and over, it's not easy for us quiltators.
I
Well,
was
I
buying
wonder-
those.
I wonder if the sateen, the fabric itself, is a
Mhm.
clue, because
That's a good point.
when did that? I mean, I know it was available in kits in the early 30s, but prior to that, maybe not so much. But I'm surprised to see it
Yeah.
so much there in eastern, right, southeastern Pennsylvania. Is that what we're talking about?
Mhm.
I'm just surprised. That would be my key. If I looked at that and I saw those dark fabrics, but then sateen, I would say, whoa, what's going on here?
Mhm.
And I would begin to question whether it was a 19th century or a,
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Thinking about cotton sateen in the 19th century. We should explain sateen is a weave and it floats several threads on the top rather than up and down. And having thought it was pretty and trying to quilt through it, forget it. It's really tough to get your needle through it.
Yeah.
So I think it was a fashion that came and went when that hand quilter said, oh no, it's not going to be $6. It's going to be $8 if it's sateen.
Mm.
We don't
I'm
want
wondering
it.
if your comment that there were so few of the designer and kit quilts that you found. I'm thinking about that in comparison to my family story that's coming up. If this was an economic factor that women just couldn't afford to buy the kits.
That's true.
Oh, I don't know. It's just there are so few of them. It's not the kits. You do start to see the sort of fancy design quilt kits with the swag borders and all, but the ones by name designers. I mean, even though Ann Orr and Murray Webster were in national publications, they just don't turn up over over just years and years and years of auctions at various levels of family wealth, and they just weren't very popular here for whatever reason.
So Debbie, are you saying that they were published in magazines and newspapers and it wouldn't require buying the kit itself? Right?
No, it's just that they got plenty of publicity,
Uh-huh.
and still they didn't attend
But
to
you
make
would have to
publicity.
buy fabric specifically to make that quilt. You weren't
Yeah.
just using
Mhm.
scraps
no-
or whatever.
No
Yeah.
scrap packs. Well, we got to move on. We're going to go to our guest know-it-all, Janneken Smucker, who has a PhD. So she's a professional, and she has a job. Now, she told me what it was, and I've misplaced it. You tell me where you work. She's a professor, and she spent the past couple of years working on a project from the Roosevelt years, and she's kept a website about it. So we've been watching it. And she's at Westchester University in Pennsylvania. So she's going to show us her PowerPoint, and we're going to learn a lot.
Hi, everyone. I'm Janneken. It's so nice to be joining you all today. And I thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really happy to have a chance to talk with the real experts about this topic. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the project as a whole, which I call a New Deal for Quilts. Then I'll narrow in and talk a little bit about the role of home economists during the New Deal era, who often were employed by the federal government, and they were spreading the gospel of all kinds of homemaking practices, including quilt making during this era. But first, a little bit of bigger picture. So here's the website. You can also scan it if you prefer to get there that way. It will be a book coming out in next fall. And there'll be a small exhibit accompanying it at the International Quilt Museum as well. Looking forward to all of that. Looking forward to really actually coming to fruition. I started the project during spring of 2020, so I've had lots of ups and downs, and all of my archival research trips were canceled. Thank you to people like Mary Kay, who generously sent me files so I could still access things. So overall, this project is about the role that quilts and quilt making played in the federal government's relief and programs during the New Deal. And the federal government really tried to use quilts and quilt making to show women how they could contribute to their family's betterment in various ways. They also used quilts in some of their PR campaigns, generating empathy for the poor and migrant families, and really also taught quilt making, showing Americans that they could create and use thrifty domestic objects. And a lot of that was drawing on the whole mythology of the colonial revival, that quilts were part of the way we could persevere through these hard times. So in short, the message of the Great Depression, of course, and the New Deal is there were difficulties, but encouragement. And these 4-H girls are exemplifying that. And they, of course, would have been learning their skills from home economists of the time. So a little bit of a march quickly through sort of the themes of the book. This is a quilt some of you may already be familiar with. It's really from pre-New Deal. This is the Hoover administration, where people are looking eagerly for prosperity around the corner and really not finding it. My project originated in large part from by discovering that there were so many photographs in the Farm Security Administration photo archive of quilts and quilt making. And these photos are essentially propaganda. These are government hired photographers who were taking photos for government publicity to show both the plight of Americans during this time period, but also how they were persevering. And there are hundreds of images of quilts and quilt making in this archive. So I started to think, well, why are they using quilts as propaganda? And that's sort of where this project originated. There were also federally funded sewing rooms. We'll hear a little bit more from Mary Kay about the Milwaukee Handicraft Project today. But there were also, this is pre-WPA, the FARA, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, had sewing rooms, and this is one of those at the state level in California. There were also an outpouring of quilts made by Americans in celebration of the New Deal. Quite a few from a very short-lived administration of the New Deal called the National Recovery Act, which resulted in the National Recovery Administration. As Mary Kay has also written about extensively, there were quilts made by African-American women who were married to workers on the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. They made these very modernist quilt designs. And then there were many Americans who sent quilts to the Roosevelts as gifts, and also to other New Deal officials as thank you gifts, sometimes pitching Eleanor, would you buy this quilt from me, as a way to get money as well. The Index of American Design was a project of the Federal Arts Project, and it documented historic folk and decorative arts, including hundreds of quilts, painting lifelike watercolor paintings of them. I've been fortunate enough to finally get a hold of the data sheets on the objects on which the paintings are based, and they've never really been paired before with the quilts themselves. And so I've been doing a lot of detective work, actually learning about the quilts that were painted. And in Pennsylvania, where I also live, as does Debbie, a division of the Museum Extension Project even produced these screen printed quilt patterns, and they were aimed to distribute them to schools and libraries, although it's questionable how much of that actually happened. Minnie Benberry, who is the mother-in-law of noted quilt historian Questa Benberry and friend of many of the know-it-alls here in the panel today, who's no longer with us, sadly. Minnie, her mother-in-law, lived in Western Kentucky during the Depression and recalled that a governmental worker came to visit the African-American farm families scattered in Western Kentucky and she brought this quilt pattern with her. And then when the women all gathered in the spring in the churchyard to collectively quilt their quilt tops, they were surprised that they each had used the same pattern, unaware that the federal worker had distributed this pattern to everyone for miles. And these Black quilt makers gave the pattern the name WPA tulip quilt. And such experts like whoever this woman was, who visited Minnie Benbury, worked in a variety of capacities as home economists, sometimes professional, educated, trained home economists, sometimes a more loose expertise. And they were tasked by the federal government in helping rural women keep up their homes in the midst of the Depression, promoting skills such as gardening, canning, nutrition, home beautification, and home sewing, including quilt making. They were doing this in group settings, but also encouraging women to make quilts individually that they could sell to supplement their families' very meager incomes. These experts taught quilt making in the 100 or so planned communities that were established by New Deal agencies, such as the Flint River Farms in Georgia, where poor African-American families have been relocated and provided with homes, garden plots, and educational opportunities, like the one you see here. They're, I think this quilt might be much more of a prop, but they are actually making a variety of handcrafts here. In this image, we have a women's group. Home demonstration agents were employed by what was called the Extension Service. This still exists today, federally funded program. And sometimes the home demonstration agents actually were working for the WPA or the Farm Security Administration, and they often facilitated these women's clubs like the one you see here. This was in a community, also a planned community, where the coal industry had shut down during the Great Depression. And so this planned community aimed to provide other industry and sort of subsistence farming opportunities. They also had clubs to make quilts. There were experts who worked in WPA sewing rooms, directing others in how to make quilts. And then these quilts were usually given, distributed to relief families. They were also, women kind of learned that quilt making skill and then could make them on their own as well. This particular expert, Octa Self, has such an unusual name that I have been able to learn a little bit about her background as well, which I'd be happy to share. Some home economists were really directly providing vocational training, like you see here at a WPA emergency school with a white teacher training a group of African-American women on how to make quilts and other needlecrafts. And then finally, in the Farm Security Administration migratory labor camps, which were predominantly found in the Southwest and on the West Coast, they also employed home economists to staff the home ec buildings, which were found in each of these temporary camps. Here, the women were learning how to card surplus commodity cotton to fill the quilts that they were making. One of my most recent archival finds, now that I've actually been able to visit in-person archives, was a collection of newsletters from the various FSA camps, which thankfully include updates from the home economists and the women's sewing clubs. So I was able to learn a little bit more about their quilts. So were these actually experts? They usually were college educated, creating a class hierarchy with their clientele. And they had to make a dramatic pivot from their role. Like home economists as a field had already emerged in the 19-teens and 20s. But at that point, they were really teaching women how to be better consumers by buying modern appliances and becoming more efficient homemakers. And in part, this is really to support the growing electrical and gas utility companies at that time. But in the 1930s, they were really needed to focus, instead of on consumer culture, on home production. And so that's when they come in and show women how to recycle goods, how to can. They distribute pressure cookers to lots of these farm women. And they were learning new skills as well, and the values that went with those new skills, sometimes for just being a good homemaker at home, but also sometimes for going out and using those skills in vocational settings. And they were really teaching methods that could be in reach for women during the Great Depression. Here, this is actually a National Youth Association, girls in the very famous quilt making community of Gee's Bend, Alabama, where the home economists have come in to teach them how to use these treadle sewing machines. So I'm happy to share lots of details. As you can tell, this is just the flight of the bigger project I'm working on, but I'm really interested in this kind of pivotal role I'm seeing home economists playing in the distribution of quilt expertise and knowledge.
Hmm.
Wow.
Oh,
Wow.
Excellent.
I can't wait for the book.
yeah, I had no
Me
idea.
too, me too.
I'm
Barbara, you're muted.
muted.
I know. The problem with all this history is that the war came and everybody's focus changed.
Mhm.
So all the records, just it's like Indiana Jones in the Temple of Doom or something. They all got filed away and nobody paid any attention to them because the war was so much more important. So
Right.
now we as women's historians have to go back and look at that because it was so important in the 30s and such an important part of the Depression. So
I think so many of the skills, that we associate with the Depression, all the frugality, a lot of it was being taught actually as part, as by all of these, the FSA agents, the home extension agents, they're out there promoting these skills.
mhm.
I'm very taken by how many of the teachers were white,
Mhm.
whether and what impact that had on style.
Yeah, I'm really intrigued by this as well. And I've been writing a little bit about that real clear power dynamic, and particularly in the South, many of the white home economists had certain feelings about what was appropriate for African Americans to be doing, and really were in some ways encouraging them not to don't do things that are too ostentatious, like be in your station in some ways. But I also am very curious about, I'm sure all of you here on this panel and probably a lot of our listeners are familiar with this kind of, there's sort of a dichotomy of can we tell what African American quilts looked like from this era? Were they all these improvisational scrappy quilts, or were they using patterns? And the late Questa Benberry was at the forefront of that conversation, and she really showed that African Americans were using the commercially available patterns and so forth. But I'm curious if some of this that they're getting these patterns in part through these white ladies who are sharing their expertise.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
When I studied the 30s, and I hear it echoes in your presentation too. And the name of the book I wrote was Soft Covers for Hard Times.
It's indispensable to me, I will just say.
And that, I didn't come up with that title, but that is exactly what I worried about, was all those great projects that I revered and I respected, and I wondered if indeed, you mentioned propaganda, cover, this, softening, romanticism. How can we accurately, how can we accurately portray or depict what was going on there, or was that what was going on there? I felt like what I think is kind of interesting is to look at the fact that you found so many photographs of Black women together. That is an incredible resource, just like Barbara said. We had to dig those out. Luckily, that woman, well, Russell Lee and Woolcott woman were important people, and they did come out. But I just think it's fascinating to be able to. I was looking at them, and wondering, look in their faces. What more can we read from this? So
There's so much
I
more
do
to
a
be
lot
done.
of that, like visual. So much of what, as Barbara alludes to, it's like we're using like real circumstantial evidence here. And like, I'm having to do so much just visual analysis of these photographs.
Mhm.
And this is just scratching the surface here to try to kind of imagine what's going on.
And we can track each of those women too. I mean, that's hard to do because women are hard to track. But those home economists, I mean, it's fascinating that here was a job for women that was a good job. And the government was supporting it, but it's just so lost. It's fascinating. And I am sure in the next 10 years, we will do a lot more. We will be doing a lot more. So we're going to go to Mary Kay, who I didn't introduce Debbie, but like Mary Kay, Debbie is a collector who's an independent scholar and a very curious person. And Mary Kay has spent a long time looking at the Milwaukee workshop. And so she's going to tell us about what she has seen in the Milwaukee project, the Milwaukee Handicraft Project. So here we go.
Okay, thank you. I hope I'm doing this. Yeah. here we
All you
go.
got to do is put your slideshow on.
Okay.
There you go. That's cool.
Well, this is a very interesting transitional piece because what I'm doing here is zeroing in on one particular WPA sewing project, but it was really a handcraft project. And it was led by a woman who had completely different ideas than those home demonstration agents. But here we go. It was called the WPA Handicraft Project, lasted from November 1935 through 1943. And I am dedicating this program to the woman, my mentor, Mary June Kellogg Rice, who was the art director of that project. And when I found this sailboat quilt in the seen here in the bottom right, here in Knoxville, I just decided to track down the history behind the quilt. And like a lot of people, I thought the WPA and New Deal projects and the CCC was all about bridges and roads and state parks and national parks and things like that. I was thrilled to find out on the back, I'm thrilled to find out that this was a women's project and it had to do with sewing. My first paper was written at the encouragement of Bets Ramsey in Uncoverings 1984. It was called Quilts in the WPA Milwaukee Handicraft Project, edited by the venerable Sally Garrett in 1984. So I began the research on this in about 83, and I reached out. Like Barbara just said, there were no records at all. I actually went to Washington, went to the archives. They brought down this huge bunch of material that was all wrapped up, and I went through it, and basically all I found, and it was very important in the end, I found price lists for some of the things that they sold. But at the time, so I didn't even know what I'd found. But anyway, this is Mary Rice and me in 2003. She passed away a couple of years later, at close to the age of 100. But she was the art director of the project. And she was thrilled that I had come and found her in Tiburon, California, but I don't think she ever thought I had done enough. And so in 2003, she published a book herself and tried to find this. It's an incredible, I think it's the best book ever written about a WPA project. It was published by the Milwaukee Historical Society in 2003. And a lot of the photos that you're going to see in my program come from this book. And most of these photos, the black and white photos, were, they had a team at the Milwaukee Handicraft Project to photograph everybody. I mean, here they are photographing some of the workers, and it's just a great documentation of a particular project. And here is Mary Rice in 1937. She was born, I think, in 1912. So she's, you know, newly, that's not, yeah, she was about 22 here. She had graduated with an art degree from Milwaukee State Teachers College. And so she credited the success of this particular project to the project director, Elsa Albright, who lived from 1885 to 1980. And I found out that Eleanor Roosevelt's birth and death dates are, well, she didn't live quite that long, but she was born about that time. So was Frank Lloyd Wright. Elsa grew up in a family in Milwaukee and was very interested in craft, in art. She went to school to become an artist. She traveled to England and studied, was enthralled with all things arts and crafts. William Morris, and I think you're going to see that in influence as it goes on. So the picture on the right is her in 1980, and on the left, early on, as an art historian taking a class to a museum. And then in the center, she's working with one of the workers at the project. So I just put this all together to say it in one place, and I'm using the cover of Mary's book to basically tell you what their project was. What it hoped to be was to teach women the skills, and it was primarily for women who were on the relief roll, who were unskilled, non-English speaking, low income, African-American, and to teach them skills that not only would possibly give them a job, an employment, but to raise their self-esteem. They felt like in the process of creating, it would make them feel better, incorporate them more into the American society. It had a little bit different influence than what we saw in some of the other projects, but maybe not so much. Anyway, the skills learned were everything from quilt making, toy making, rug making, weaving, linoleum block printing, book binding, doll making, way more than just sewing. Wages earned, I don't think we've talked about that yet. These WPA workers were given a check from the government of $60 a month. So all of these women received $60 a month. It also meant that they went off the relief rolls. So it wasn't terribly exciting to do that, but these women, and there were 5,000 employed over 7 years there in Milwaukee. The products then, to make this a success, they sold the products and they created products. The staff created products for a specific function, a lot like arts and crafts. So you're going to see quilts, coverlets, all kinds of things going on. They made the upholstery for the University of Wisconsin dormitories. They provided toys and coverlets for daycare and children's homes, on and on. And very importantly, they also supplied things like portfolios of their designs to colleges and museums. So teachers were learning how to teach these particular crafts. And the brilliant part of the whole thing, at least for Elsa was told in the beginning, all you really need to do is have the women cut out pictures from magazines and put them in, paste them on paper and bind them together for scrapbooks, and we'll give them to the prisoners at the penitentiaries. That to her seemed like make work. And to her credit, she didn't say no to that. She said, oh, there'll be some binding going on, but it's not going to be exactly what you think. She was a professor at the art department there at the Milwaukee State Teachers College, which today is University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. She hired some of her best students who turned out to be the designers and the teachers in the different sections of the Milwaukee Handicraft Project. This is Frances Kawa, who's responsible for the beautiful designs of the block printed textiles. One of the other things they did was promote the fact that they had a pretty cool project. And one day Eleanor Roosevelt visited the project in November 1936, 1 year, and it was on the 1 year anniversary it happened to occur. And Miss Eleanor wrote, so often in WPA handwork projects, this is after she visited the building. So often the WPA handwork projects, the skill is there, but the taste, which is after all an important part, both in beautifying and making a saleable article, is entirely absent. In this case, the Milwaukee Handicraft Project, taste and skill are combined, and the teachers are doing an exceptionally good piece of work. They were real happy to hear that, and they sent Eleanor a lot of presents along the way. You'll see one later. Another way they marketed their program and their products was through state fair displays and at the New York World's Fair. At that state fair, they had 200 women demonstrating how they were making these projects. Again, adding self-esteem and the pride in their workmanship and showing others how they were making these products. This is a display of products produced by the Handicraft Project. We're not sure where it was, but I assume it's there in Milwaukee. You can see on the right some of the textiles. We're going to talk about those in particular. But there was everything made from costume design to block prints to dolls, toys, and they're available there. So what I thought I would do is just look at the quilts in particular. There were about 12 designs that were in that price list. At the time, I actually wrote to Julia Loomis, and she told me when I was writing this about 1984, that both she and Dorothy designed most of the quilts. And the one below her is the cherry tree quilt that she particularly liked. And she said Dorothy actually did the sailboat quilt. Now in my price list, both quilts, excuse me, the sailboat quilt on the left only came as a nursery size 40 by 60. And the cost of this was $1.25 because they were restricted in selling it. And they couldn't sell it beyond the cost of the materials that were paid for by the government. So it cost $1.25. The one on the right is also a nursery size, but it was sold in two other sizes, 3/4 and full size. Each one has a kind of a stamp on the back. And if you ever come upon these, look for it. There's the sailboat quilt had Project 8601. And I was able to determine that those are really contract numbers, and it actually really pinpoints the date when those quilts, or at least that quilt was made. So here's my quilt on the right. And I remember when I first got it, and I was so struck by well, it's all solid fabrics. There's no batting. There is quilting in the plain areas. The piece block is incredibly hard to do. I was really impressed with the mitered corners, and I wondered what this was made for. And finally, and in Mary's book, she has a number of photographs showing how this quilt was used. In fact, in the one on the upper right, it was used as a divider, kind of a wall hanging between hospital beds. And the one where the little girls are reading, it's in a library. So those are not quilts. But here's an example. Well, again, on the wall is a drapery made kind of to decorate, again, with that design of the sailboat. And look at all these cots. They're cots, they're not beds. This is a nursery center, kind of a daycare center. So they're not going to spend the night here. They are just here, probably taking their nap. Look at all the little kids. And you could see those, every one of them has a coverlet on them. And they have little hooked rugs that would have been made also by the women at the project. Now this instead was Mary calls it the Milwaukee County Home for Dependent Children. I think in my book, I called it the orphanage, but this is Mary. And that's probably the actual name it was called. And they were shortened beds, and each one of them had a mattress and a gray blanket on top of it. She told me, Mary told me, she was the one who went to this home and realized, she said, why aren't there, what you need is something cheerful. And so she went back to the project and ordered 600 of these little quilts made. And she said, we have a doll making unit too, let's make dolls. And so this is how it evolved. So in the sewing section, they're quilting and doing applique. And in the doll making section, they're making hundreds and hundreds of dolls. And this is Bernice Ware. She's the only one of the workers who has a name attached to her. She's smiling. There's a special article about her. She got to be an expert in making the wigs for the dolls. And then as we go on, as the years went on, after I wrote the book, other people started finding things, and usually my quilt friends. And the one on the left is a quilt made in the county children's home, and it's found in California, and it's in the collection of Carolyn Gabel. And then Barbara Fickow in Wisconsin had a whole bunch of just little cloth blocks that she said came from the workshop. And they all look like sample blocks for some quilts were made, some were not. And then in the Wisconsin State Quilt Project book, these 3 quilts, all owned by Dolores Sundin. She didn't work there, but she was a 4th grade teacher at that time. And she said the school where she was working purchased these, and eventually when they were deaccessioned, she bought them. And so these are in fact on that price list. And then finally, I just got this one. So, and it's the quilt behind me. Some of you are probably wondering. And it's the only full-sized quilt that I've ever seen. And it cost $3.25 at the time for materials. I purchased it from a woman in Texas who had owned it for years and years and years. It was also available nursery size and 3/4 size. And it was made of pre-shrunk percale. Mary Rice told me that she always looked for the highest quality products she could buy. By this point, and I just noticed this by doing this program, this is all machine applique. It is, so you can, and there is quilting in those blank areas. So I like to finish by talking a bit about these, about the results of the project. Here's Eleanor Roosevelt, much later in life, with a Milwaukee WPA Rubaiyat block printed wall hanging at her home there in Hyde Park. And we were talking about, these are artists who've now created a textile about the Rubaiyat poem, this Persian lyrical poem, very high scale. And then look at, and this is what they were printing in the block printing department. Incredible design. This is a Francis Kawa design to the right. Both of these pieces were found after Eleanor died, and they are now in the Franklin Roosevelt Museum Library. Here's a close-up of the Rubaiyat block print, thanks to our own know-it-all, Lynn Bassett. She found, when she worked there, she found these in the back, in the collection at the University of Connecticut School of Fine Arts. Here are some more. They indeed had another one of the workers, hanging on the left and this other one too. So how did they end up in those museums? Oops, because Elsa Albright felt like this was so important. What they were doing is that she encouraged people to come visit the museum, come see what they were doing, and to take home portfolios and examples of the project. So Mary Rice, and as we close here, Mary Rice Kellogg was very proud of this program. And she and I both wondered, I wonder still, about what makes this project unique. And she really wondered how it could be replicated today. So I pose those two questions to you, or any other comments that you have about this. And I will stop sharing.
Wow.
I can tell you for the Yukon pieces there, that collection was organized in the 1920s, I think, and in the 1930s, they actually had money to go out and buy things. And a particular person on the home ec department, who was buying for the collection. I think that's probably how that got there.
Interesting.
Well, Mary Kay, you talk quite a bit, so we don't have much time for comments. So we have to go on if you don't mind. But that's all right. We love listening to it. It's pretty fascinating. So our next speaker is Lynn Bassett, who has much experience in costume history. She's my go-to expert on anything with costumes, but she's going to talk about her own family. She grew up in Montana, which I find a very romantic thought. So Lynn, why don't you show us what you're going to talk about today?
Make sure why that. Are you seeing it as you should?
We are seeing
Yes.
it as we should.
Okay. Well, those of you who know me know that my area of expertise on quilts and such is pre-20th century. So what I have to offer here is a very personal family story of my parents and the quilts that I grew up with. When I was helping with documenting quilts for the Mass Quilts Project, I remember one day when a woman came in with a bunch of very ordinary 1930s scrappy pieced quilt blocks. But the story she told literally had those of us who were documenting that day choking back tears. She said that these blocks were from her childhood in the Great Depression, when her mother would have her and her siblings stitch quilt blocks to keep them from thinking about how hungry they were. And remarkably for her, this was a fond memory. Mary Kay's classic soft covers for hard times, even its title suggests that Depression-era quilts with their pretty pastel colors and cheerful floral prints provided both physical and psychological comfort to struggling women and families during this miserable period in American history. I've always been interested in the history and memories that are stitched into quilts. To me, they are manifestations of the social, political, and economic history of any period in which they were made. My presentation today is about my family quilts and my mother's and my divergence of opinion regarding them. Mine is not a story of fond memories of quilts bringing comfort in hard times. I grew up with two quilts in my family. One was a signature quilt in the chimney sweep pattern that my father had won in a church raffle before my parents were married. So in the World War II period. And that is not it. That one is from the West Virginia Quilt Documentation Project. The second quilt was made by my dad's maternal grandmother, Laura Allard, in 1942, when my dad signed up to go to war and joined the Army Air Corps. It's a patriotic quilt in the Stars of Stripes pattern, as I was informed by Sue Reich. More about that later. I consider my brother lucky because he got to have these quilts on his bed. The stories of these quilts, though they both belong to my dad, are entwined with my mother's childhood. So let me give a little background on both of them. My mother grew up in Hardin, Montana. And this is, you can just see the Montana outline here. This is Montana, North Dakota, and South Dakota. My mother grew up here in Hardin, Montana, which is right on the corner of the Crow Agency. My dad grew up here in the area of Belle Fourche, South Dakota, where his grandfather had a homestead for a while. And then eventually he was over here in just over the line in North Dakota. I think my star might have migrated a bit in Cannonball, North Carolina. My paternal grandparents had bought land near Belle Fourche in the 1920s, but they lost their farm in the Great Depression. My grandfather was luckier than many, though, in that he was able to get a job as an agent on the Standing Rock Reservation, working as a representative of the government for the Sioux, trying to teach them to farm, which the hunting peripatetic culture of the Sioux, combined with the severe drought of the decade, made difficult, to say the least. The Sioux named my grandfather Standing Shooter. My dad, bless his heart, left oral history tapes giving wonderful details of his youth. In writing up this presentation, I made the connection for the first time between this picture and a passage in Dad's oral history. We had a windmill and a pump there for water, and the windmill didn't work very well. Our well was really deep, and it was very hard to pump by hand, and I'd throw my complete weight onto the handle and get it going that way. And I used to have to pump water for the cow and my horse, Crappie, for the water tank, and it was quite a job pumping for them. This was back in the 30s, what we called the dirty 30s, because of all the dust storms and everything. And it was very dry, very little water and very little grass. There'd be a couple or three Indian horses would come up every once in a while and stand around this water tank trying to get a drink. And I'd take pity on them, and I'd go out and struggle with that pump and pump water for them. I just wanted you to see how dry that landscape is. Neither of my parents grew up with running water, electricity, or central heating. My dad's oral history continues. We had some neighbors up the river, up the Cannonball, not more than a mile or two, by the name of Upham, and they were good friends. We were neighbors back and forth with them. Mrs. Upham once or twice came to the house to visit with Mother because she just couldn't stand the sound of the cattle coming down to the ranch headquarters there and hanging over the fence and bawling because they were hungry and there was no water for them. And she just couldn't stand it. And so she'd come down and visit with my mother. Times were really tough then. A lot of people were going belly up. They were losing everything. And one night the Uphams came to our place and told us goodbye. Oh, they were leaving in the middle of the night ahead of their creditors because they just couldn't do it anymore. Oh. This is my mom. My mom's family was in a similar situation in Montana at this time. Her father lost his farm and they moved into town. I just wanted you to see again the landscape, how bare and dry it is. Mm-hmm. My grandfather, though his situation was desperate, and this is funny, was a staunch Republican and disapproved of Roosevelt's New Deal. My mother told the story of how her father and uncle got into a heated argument about the New Deal one evening. And her father was still so angry in the morning that he walked over to his brother-in-law's farm, found him milking, and decked him. My grandmother didn't talk to him for 2 weeks. I find this extremely amusing because my grandfather, who was a very quiet and reserved Swede, eventually became Justice of the Peace, and he was called Judge Danielson by everyone in the area. So the next challenge of my parents' generation was World War II. My dad joined the Army Air Corps in 1942, and his maternal grandmother, Laura Allard, made him a quilt in recognition of his patriotism. The quilt won a blue ribbon in the Butte County Fair in Nisland, South Dakota that year. And I was checking newspapers.com, hoping to find some context and, really hoping to find a statement about my grandmother's blue ribbon or something. But no, but it was very interesting, the comments related to the war effort and how the people who were organizing the fair were asked to not do it in order to save rubber. But they were like, no, we've already signed too many contracts, we're doing it. But then there was also articles about how people were worried about the shortage of chocolate and sugar for the goodies at the fair. And but apparently they came through with that too. Anyway,
I'm going to interrupt here and say, you look just like that woman.
no kidding. Yeah, I look like both my
Go on.
grandmothers. Yeah. Okay. So between the star blocks, my great-grandmother quilted wing motifs, I think as a symbol of the Army Air Corps. I always thought this quilt was really wonderful because of the story that went with it. And even as a kid, I saw those wings there and associated them with Dad's Army Air Corps patch, though he kind of poo-pooed the idea. Okay, so my parents didn't really respect the quilt as I did, and they used it to pad the furniture when we moved to Massachusetts. When I found out, I took the quilt away from them to save it from further damage and carelessness. Unfortunately, it was too late for the signature quilt. My mother had thrown it away, and she was completely baffled when I expressed my dismay upon learning of this tragedy. It was ugly, she said. But as a kid, I had loved looking at the old-fashioned names, Mabel, Ruth, Violet, and so on. So now we come to the struggle for understanding between my mother and I regarding the value of patchwork quilts. She didn't mince words about her feelings on the matter, calling them junk and ugly. After one particularly cutting remark, I called her out and demanded an apology and an explanation. Of course, she had not meant to hurt my feelings, and she felt really bad. But she thought about why she had such an aversion to quilts and explained to me that they brought back really difficult, unpleasant memories of being poor in the Depression. Just in general, she didn't like anything old, hand-me-down, or even retro. I was not allowed to wear overalls in the 1970s like my peers. So that was really helpful to me to understand where she was coming from. And I think it's a revealing insight that provides a more complete understanding of Depression-era quilts. This is a statement by my grandfather that's remembered in my family and passed down as a reminder to be grateful for our blessings. And it certainly speaks to the difficulties of the Great Depression. The year after my dad died, I wrote up my thoughts about his quilt, placing it in the context of my family history and the National World War II effort. When my mother read it, she started to cry. She started to cry and she said, I never understood. So that was another major breakthrough in our mutual understanding.
Mm.
I have to admit, I've gotten a lot of mileage out of this simple quilt. I am grateful to Sue Reich for including it in her book of World War II quilts, which provides yet more excellent context for its creation. So pulling together this little presentation and going through my dad's oral histories makes me grieve the loss of the friendship quilt all the more. The rarity of its type by 1940 is underscored by the fact I couldn't find anything remotely like it as an image for my PowerPoint. It would have been wonderful to have as information to add to my dad's oral histories, giving evidence of his community at the time. Oh, well. And I just really wish my parents had lived to see the quilt on the cover of Quilt Folk magazine. I know it would have blown their minds. And that's it.
You want to
I'll
stop
my
screen
share.
share?
Okay.
Well, you know, that's so effective. And your life has been so, although we're very good friends, your experiences are so different from mine. You know, it's just hard to think about cows, hungry cows. You know,
Well, and
it's great to hear it because
well, and
like many women's stories, it gets ignored.
yeah, and I realize it's very personal, not deeply researched or anything, but I think it's an important perspective that is often missed. and the context of my dad's oral histories is really remarkable. And I think it just really, I also think about how my mother hated the song "You Are My Sunshine" because it was so popular in the Depression, and she hated that song.
Oh, she did.
She hated it.
She just,
And
the memories.
anything.
Well, it's
anything of that.
post-traumatic.
Yeah.
As a psychologist, it's post-traumatic stress syndrome,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Mm-hmm.
I think you're.
and the quilts are associated with it.
I think you and we, by association, are very lucky here. Not only to hear this story, but to have your mom be so upfront and communicative about what her real feelings were.
Oh yeah, she never minced words.
And also, I love the part about how you two found a way to understand each other better.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Really wonderful.
Yeah, we both came around.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to talk about my family later, but you know, when I started doing quilts as a profession, my mother had 9 sisters, and they were expressive, and they lived in New York City. And I said, "Do you guys have any quilts?" And my Aunt Vera, who I have patterned my life upon, and she was very cynical and very, very direct. She said, "As soon as we got 2 nickels to rub together, we got rid of them."
Yeah.
So there was no sentiment there. There were no tears. It was just out. You know, we bought blankets. Thank you very much.
There's probably so much more of this than we would know, because people don't want to say it, right? They want to rose-colored glasses, the
Right.
whole deal.
Mhm.
Right.
So important. And so typical that people wait, that psychologically it takes 50 years for people to come around. We see that all the time in World War II and the
Mhm.
Holocaust and all that, you know, everything that people went through.
Mhm.
This is making me realize, just, you know, we kind of see that, I mean, that as in one of your earlier episodes, that 1960s quilt, you know, Mary Kay mentions, like, we don't talk about the quilts from the 1960s, but so much I'm wondering, you know, that gap in the mid 20th century, it's not necessarily that it's, perhaps there's a lot more of this sentiment that people just didn't want the association of quilts that were so ubiquitous during the 30s.
Mhm.
They just
And
didn't want.
your presentation, Janneken, really made me realize how, you know, pushed upon people, you know, quilts
Yeah.
were, that I think there was probably a lot of that going on in my mom's community, and that's also part of all this, this sentiment she had about it.
On a variation of that, when I was looking for quilts in the early 70s, when I had a shop, I went up to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and put an ad in the paper and said I was looking for quilts, and got some very interesting responses. But one was from a woman who at that time was in her 80s, and she was living in a trailer on their farm because her husband was disabled in some way. And she had put she was ready to sell quilts, and she put all her quilts on a bed, and most of them were applique, and they were at that time she wanted $150 for these applique quilts, and I had never spent more than $45 on a quilt up until that point. And they were beautiful, and Linda and I did buy a bunch of them. But as she peeled them off, she'd get to a patchwork quilt and she'd say, "Oh, that old thing." And so her deal was that applique quilts were cool. Pieced quilts, that's for the riffraff. And they were great. And we bought them for $10. And they were, and one of them I'll never forget. It was so good. It was a red and white drunkard's path, and each curve had sawtooth. It was a sawtooth.
Oh my God.
Perfectly.
Oh,
It was so
triangles.
perfectly made. Triangles, right. It was so perfectly made, it looked printed. It was just great. $10.
Oh. Well, we have to move on. And our next speaker, who's going to add a little levity to this, is Ms. Julie Silber, who is telling us secrets about her career as a quilt dealer, when you can buy quilts for $10 and sell them for $20. Yeah. So Julie, if you want to share your screen. tell us about donkeys, Scotties, and other New Deal imagery.
Critters.
We're ready.
We're ready.
We're
Hi,
ready.
everybody. Hi, everybody. I'm Julie Silber, and I'm going to talk to you about some critters that show up in textiles during the Roosevelt years. So let's see what we got here. During the 30s, at 20s, 30s, and 40s, we see lots and lots and lots and lots of Scotties. And one wonders why. Some people claim that it was a throwback or a tip of the hat to Princess Victoria, who became Queen Victoria, who had a Scottie. The image, however, and the dogs themselves were so lovable and popular and have been for quite some time. And we see images on items that were popular and for sale, including fabrics. I love this one that has to tell us that it's a Scottie dog. See, Scottie dog, Scottie dog, Scottie dog. And this is, I think we got rid of him, but he was a Monopoly player thing. Here are some Scotties that show up. This friendship quilt block was dated 1933, and there you can see the Scotties doing all the domestic work, which was just great. Whichever woman taught her dog to do all that was just a genius. But we see them show up all the time. And then we start to see them in the 30s to show up as quilt patterns. This one, as you can see, is dated 1939. It's an Alice Brooks pattern. And there's a whole bunch more. So let's go see what else. 1937, Scotties with a bow tie. 1942, a Laura Wheeler design. Let's see, the one on the left is who? I've forgotten it. Laura Wheeler on the right. And very often the Scotties on the left are printed fabrics of all kinds. Scotties on the right are suggesting tartan fabrics, and a lot of them did show up that way. They're Scotties after all. 1937 and 1938, these showed up in newspapers, as you can see, the Alice Brooks Scottie. While we're here, I want you to notice what the text says. Hootman, here's a Scottie quilt. Scottie quilt is true thrift. They're all connected to Scotland. And here are some more. Nancy Cabot on the right, 1936 to 1938. And again, you can see the patterns are printed with tartan, or a kind of a suggestion of that. But all the text is about, it's cute, it's warm, your kids are gonna love it. There's nothing political about any of these patterns, in spite of the fact that the patterns came out during the Roosevelt years. So what's that about? 1936, a Kansas City Star pattern. This one they're calling the dog quilt, and the text says that a young girl in her early teens designed this clever block for a pillow. They're calling it an original design here. And they show up in various ways. There's just lots and lots and lots of these quilts that come out during the Roosevelt years. Including this one, which I didn't know which way to show it to you because of the way it's made. And you can see that this one was not made from a kit or a pattern. And the maker filled the Scottie with squares, pixelated in some way. Here's what seems to be the case. Scotties were always popular, but then along came Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was in the White House from 1933 to 1945, which was the time of his death, and who was always by his side. In fact, that picture, Mary Kay, I think it was that you showed of Eleanor Roosevelt, that was after he had died, and Fala went to live with her at Hyde Park, and Fala was in that picture. That's Fala, a Black Scotty that purportedly FDR adored, went with him everywhere, was always by his side. Here's his tag. Fala was born in 1940 and was given to FDR by a distant cousin who had trained the dog. The dog could do tricks. Everybody loved this dog. And he was originally named Big Boy, but Roosevelt renamed him for a famous Scottish ancestor of his, John Murray, who lived in Fala Hill. And so the kennel, he's registered with the AKC, and it's Murray, the outlaw of Fala Hill. And this was later shortened to Fala, sometimes spelled F-A-L-A and sometimes spelled F-A-L-L-A, as we'll see. Well, Fala became just incredibly important to humanizing FDR, and I don't know that he was the first pet in the White House, but he's definitely the most famous pet that ever lived in the White House. Since Roosevelt, almost everybody has pets of one sort or another. George W. Bush actually had a Scotty. But here we're talking about the Roosevelt years, and you can see these are books, and it's kind of a comic book, I think, that came out all around Fala. He got, here's spelled F-A-L-L-A. He got letters, he got marriage proposals. He went with Roosevelt everywhere. And finally, we start to see things, the toys and other things that actually have the name Fala on them, like this. Here it says Fala often accompanied Roosevelt to important events. He traveled on Sacred Cow, the president's airplane, and the Ferdinand Magellan, Roosevelt's custom-made train car, as well as by ship. He was with Roosevelt at the Atlantic Charter Conference, Quebec, and the meeting with President Camacho of Mexico in Monterrey. He went everywhere. They were best friends. And when FDR died suddenly in 1945, he was buried in the Rose Garden at Hyde Park. And here's a picture of Fala there. And he has the distinct honor of being the only pet that is with a official sculpture of a president. Good old Fala. Fala died in 1952 and is buried very near, here you can see this. They had another dog called Chief, who earlier, but Fala died in 1952 at the age of 12. And I thought this was kind of interesting. This particular shot casts a shadow that almost looks like a Scotty's head. I don't think that was intentional, but it's kind of cool. So that's one of the critters we see during the Roosevelt years. And we also see these political figures or critters. On the left, we see a donkey who was called Gidap and an elephant who was called Ararat. Both of these were published in the Kansas City Star and issued in 1931. They were designed, both of them were designed by Eveline Folland in 1931, and here are copies of the patterns. I found it interesting. I wondered for a long time, you see a whole lot more Gidaps than you do Ararat. Ararat was created just as an elephant, actually. Originally, it was made after the Swope, it says Swope Park elephant. Swope Park is a zoo in St. Louis or Kansas City, and Eveline designed the Ararat after the elephant. But a week later, the women of the GOP decided that they wanted that as their symbol, and that is what happened. And soon thereafter, then the donkey got named Gidap and is a very, very democratic donkey, as it says right up there. I wondered for a long, I've seen many donkey quilts, And they very often are orange and brown, and I never knew why until here we are. It's telling them to make that quilt in orange and brown, white, orange and brown, and Ararat purple, gold, and white. So let's see here. Here are two very good examples of Get Up on the left in orange and brown, and Ararat, part of the Arizona Quilt Project, in just the colors that had been suggested. In 1934, another pattern came out. It says by Hetty Winthrop, and you guys may know more about her than I do. I don't know anything about her, but she published this in 1934. It would be 3 years after that original Poland designs, and she called it Mountain Canary. What, I don't exactly understand what a mountain, why, but that's what it got called. So we see billions of these. I mean, there's just so many. I'm interested in, when I finish here, if any of you has any ideas about why we have been left so many more donkeys than, so many more Gidaps than Ararats. Most of the ones that we see, or most of the ones that I could find, are really, they follow the pattern, Evelyn Foland's pattern, and Barbara did a wonderful blog on Evelyn, but some of them, and these two were made later in Alabama, some of them go their own way. This is Mary Maxton, who made these in 1985. But it's nice to see them where they are directly connected to Roosevelt. And this is a quilt from the collection of Joyce Ofterheide. And it doesn't have the saddle of the original pattern, but she, the maker, put Roosevelt 1941, third term 1945. One assumes that she was very pleased with this and made this quilt. Here's a photo that Barbara Barbara Brackman found for me, and what it says in the below the photo is the Democratic donkey quilt shown above was loaned by Mrs. Franklin Delano Roosevelt for the quilt display held Wednesday at the Trinity Lutheran Church, McKeesport. I presume that's Pennsylvania. Mrs. John Woodward is admiring the design. There's nothing like holding the corner of a quilt to admire a design, right? So let's see what else we got. So the quilt on the left that I think belongs to Sharon Waddell, and thank you, Sharon, has both figures. And then down in the corner, it has the last critter I'm going to talk about that has shown up in some of the presentations here earlier today. This says NRA, and we do our part, and that's in every corner of this quilt, which is also framed in red, white, and blue. So it's clearly a political and patriotic quilt. And my last slide is just going to show you how the NRA symbol showed up in a few various ways. The one on the left is a friendship quilt that is dated August 1st, 1933. And 1933 is when Roosevelt became president and the NRA was created, short-lived, but created. In the center is a kind of a tile quilt that I own that has 3 blocks that most of them are abstract. There are a few animals here and there and hearts, but there are 3 blocks in the quilt that have this NRA symbol. And then this quilt, which I believe belongs to Donna Sienkiewicz, is another one, also dated 1933. So you can see that women were presumably celebrating all of this. And so there you, oh, one more thing. Behind me is a Gidap, and he is made in orange and brown, just as promised. And then above him to the right, you may be able to see, I guess I'm going to stop share, right? Then you can really see it. There's Gidap, and right here is a stuffed Scotty that I've owned for 1,000,000 years, and I presume that it's after Falla. If it isn't, it is now. So there you go, a little bit of critters. And Barbara has some, you know, they made a million things. Talk about what you got, Barbara.
I got a hat. I made this hat, you know, I have many Scotties. Mary Kay gave me this one. I'll talk about it in my own presentation, but I've been obsessed with Franklin Roosevelt. And I have to say, for many years, my very closest friend was my vet. And when one of my dogs died, I said, I'm getting a Scotty. He said, no, you're not. He said, they bite. He said, don't do it. So I got something else. I can't remember what I got. But I always wanted a Scotty dog, but they do bite, he said. And he showed me his hand. So, so I didn't get to have a real Scotty, but I have many Scotties in my sewing room. And so thank you, Mary Kay, for the little coin purse. I mean, it's just amazing how ubiquitous, one of my favorite words, how ubiquitous they were.
Yeah.
And it was sort of political, but even Republicans probably made Scotty quilts, you know.
Well, he apparently the Republicans attacked Falla, and Roosevelt made a speech defending Falla, and there's pictures of Republican politicians cracking a smile when he defends,
which was rare.
Falla.
Well, the thing was that, you know, he was handicapped and he liked having his dog with him. And so when he traveled, he brought Falla, and the Republicans complained that it cost too much money. And apparently at one point he shipped Falla and it cost the government.
No, that's what they attacked him for, and he denied
shipping Falla.
Well,
someplace.
What the Republicans said that he had left Falla on the Aleutian Islands and then hired a boat to go get Falla. That cost.
He didn't leave Falla anywhere.
Never happened. And
no,
so he defend you defend my work, you defend my wife, but do not attack.
Do not criticize my puppy dog. Well, I went to the Roosevelt house several times, because I just adore Franklin Roosevelt. And in Eleanor's bedroom, she had a little book stand, and her bookends were Scotty dogs. You know, it's just amazing. And I have a giant collection of Scotty dogs.
I've got a couple of points, if I can interject here. Falla was not the first pet in the White House, and I don't even know if this was the first pet, but Grace Coolidge was famous for her pet. She even had a pet raccoon.
Right.
Oh, I tried that once. Don't do it.
and her first lady's portrait, of course, is with that big beautiful dog. Her Irish wolfhound, I think it was. But also I think I heard you say that the origin of the elephant as a symbol of the Republicans.
If I said that, that is incorrect. I know that Thomas Nast,
right,
and so on.
Right. Okay.
Go ahead, say something about it.
Well, just that Thomas Nast was this incredibly important political cartoonist in the 1870s, and you know, for a number of years around that period. And he's the one who created the elephant, but the donkey actually even goes back earlier to Jackson.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, I've never read that. Wow.
Yeah. So anyway, just wanted to slide that in there.
Yeah, and there were other symbols. I don't know about the GOP, maybe you guys do, but we do know that the rooster was once the symbol for the Democrats. It's changed over the years. Did the GOP have a different animal that?
Well, you know, they're fairly late. I don't think I can recall any other animal for the GOP, but that elephant's very, 1880s, and the GOP is 1850s. So interesting. We'll have to throw a study on that. All right, well, we should go on. And I guess I'm next. I'm going to take off my hat. All right, we're going to talk about fabric and World War II. And this is the Roosevelt era, of course. Now, this begins with my dad. Just like Lynn, I have family stories, but it's so different from Lynn. My dad was Jewish. He lived in New York City. He was blind in one eye, and he couldn't fight in World War II, although he tried everything to get out of that 4F. But here he is. He worked for AT&T as an accountant, and here is his office. A couple of months before I was born, all those beautiful girls are giving him a baby shower, and he got what he wanted more than anything, probably a bottle of whiskey to put up with me. But this is my father was a great photographer, and this is one of my favorite things. And over the years, I have looked at this and thought how modern those girls look, wonderful skirts and blouses, cotton. And so this is sort of a pursuit of why those women are wearing what they are. Whoops, whoops, whoops. But one of the best things I've found lately, whoops, I'm going to have to go back here, is a woman who we would call clueless in Nebraska. In 1945, the same time those women were giving my dad a shower, she's totally irritated. For over a year, I've been unable to buy 1 yard of any sort of fabric suitable for a work apron, for heaven's sakes. And every feed store in town has a stock of feed and printed sacks. I wouldn't squawk at all. But if there's feed sacks for sleazy house dresses, why can't I find nice prints, essentially, for my apron? Well, she's missed a lot in the past 3 years. So here we have this woman and a lot of printed feed sacks, and we're going to explain to her what she's been missing out on. The war began in 1939, really. America joined in 1941, but the war really began in 1939 because we committed ourselves to support the Allies. And we had to do it rather secretly because many people objected to that. But one of the ways was we supplied them with supplies. And so here we have fashion in 1939. And these women are wearing the very, very fashionable dresses, very similar to what was in my dad's photo. But I want you to notice some things. There's pleated skirts. There's patch pockets, there's double collars, there's self belts. These were what everyone was wearing. And from a girl in the Appalachians who made her own clothes, she has a self belt, she's got short sleeves, and she's got a wonderful print. A lot of people will tell you this is a feed sack, but I bet she bought that yardage. And this woman down here has made her dresses out of feed sacks, literally feed sacks, because in 1939, when this picture was taken, feed sacks tended to be just plain, just white. And so she has probably used feed sacks to make these very, very fashionable dresses with things like collars that are lined, cuffs, and self belt. She's got her belt down there too. So you can see the list of what was fashionable, and it was incredibly fashionable. But cotton became very, very hard to find because it was useful in the war effort. I mean, just think about how textiles were in tires for the tanks, for the trucks, how textiles were in the uniforms, how they were in the bedding. And so it was inevitable, as this headline says, that there would be a shortage. Now, here's some of the things it was used for. We never rationed cotton. But in Britain, Great Britain, which is the make, do, and mend on the left there, they did. You had to have ration points to get cotton yardage. In America, we did not do that, although we rationed other textiles. But rather than actually saying you had to have points to buy yardage, we made suggestions. And the woman on the right, I have lots of pictures, just like Janneken. I have looked through the Library of Congress and found so many wonderful pictures. This woman is kind of out there. She must have been advising people onto what was patriotic and what they should be doing with their cotton prints. And we shall see. Here she is again. I don't know her name. It'd be fun to find out. But anyway, the War Production Board and the Office of Price Administration, once we entered the war in 1941, didn't dictate, but they suggested patriotic clothing. And they said, no patch pockets, no cuffs, no self belts. You went out and you bought yourself a leather belt, and that was everything. No tucks, no pleats, anything that was excess fabric was unpatriotic. Now, of course, I think she's doing pretty well here, although I think that looks like a cuff. So she's out advising people. Not only did they tell you what the ceiling prices should be, because they enforced not inflation, but they suggested. And cotton prints became extremely hard to find. And there was, as I say, advice all over. So here's some of the guidelines. Mrs. America buys clothes with care. The black market is something we don't think about, but people bought fabric on the black market, and fabric was expensive, especially, well, all fabric was expensive, silk and cotton and wool, but it was traded back and forth, and that was very unpatriotic to pursue the black market, but people did. So in 1942, a year after we'd been in the war, there was a lot of complaining about the deficiency, the scarcity of cotton fabrics, the scarcity of all fabrics. And the people that complained quite loudly and quite effectively were the people who used fabric as commodity sacking. We're all familiar with feed sacks. We love the cotton prints, but there was burlap, like in the potatoes. Down here in the fertilizer, that is a 167-pound bag of fertilizer. I am not schlepping that around. So everything that was used to contain commodities that were necessities to people was being directed to the war effort. And you see at the bottom this notice to all farmers that feed sacks became a commodity that was valued. You could use them, you could sell them back to the Truesdale Milling Company. They had to be clean, and what Truesdale did with them was they refilled them. They didn't make clothes out of them, they refilled them with fertilizer and potatoes and all the other things. So this was, I think, something that happened that we have forgotten. It smacks of government intervention, which, we don't like. And it also smacks of that unhappy war. And so what happened in 1942 was that the government really began to interfere with your consumption. I don't know why Julie's up there, but instead of me. But anyway, you can see that because it's a government regulation, there were many, many pages of statistics and telling you exactly how wide it could be, exactly how much it would cost. And what they did was they decided that cotton bags for commodities were an exception to the restrictions on fabric. The people who made potatoes and fertilizer and flour had to have some kind of fabric bags to ship them in. They were important to the war effort, and so they decided that they would give a preference to people who were, to manufacturers who were making these bags, and the manufacturers responded. They were thrilled to be able you know, here they are trying to make a living during the war. They were thrilled. And they also figured out that they were the people that had access to the cotton prints. They were favored over, say, yardage manufacturers, and like ABC and Eli Walker. And so people say, here's a woman who was just discovering that feed sacks were just laying around the house. So she didn't buy any material, but she was patriotic. She helped the war effort. And I think this is what is so important in understanding that when we look at feed sacks, we are sentimental. We think depression. We think people made clothing, they made quilts out of this because they were poor. But it's far more important to realize that during the war, the government dictated what fabric would look like and what uses it was made for. So of course, feed sacks became a commodity that was traded. And you see over and over again in the 40s, mills and people who sold commodities offering higher and higher prices for reusable sacks. But this is the time when people could not get other cotton. It wasn't poverty that so much dictated the use of feed sacks. It was government regulations. And the thing is, it went on after the war. We tend to think of, well, first we think of the Depression, then the war. But after the war, I'm going to move Julie up here so you can see this. In 1945, just as the war was ending, they said, we're not going to stop dictating what you can use, what you can buy. We're going to continue to have cotton be difficult to obtain. And I don't quite understand why that was, but I would imagine it was because we were trying to supply Europe with things that they needed in the Marshall Plan and things like that. And here we have a 1946 very silly poem about using flour sacks. And the whole idea of the war, I think, is kind of summarized in this very popular sack down here on the left, which was sort of commemorated many battles in the war towards the end of the war. And everybody who collects feed sacks has to have one of these. And we all have one because they were rather common. So when we look at feed sacks and we say, oh, Depression, I want you to look at that dress. We're back to we're back to pre-war fashion. This is the new look after the war, where everybody could have a skirt out the wazoo. You know, you could have layers of collars, you could have self belts again, but there wasn't a lot of cotton around, but you could still continue to use feed sacks. So I want to emphasize here that I think that when I talk about feed sack use, it's not so much sentiment as it is practicality. Whoops, whoops, whoops. So that's the end of it, I think. So that is my rant about feed sacks not being sentimental, not being poverty, but being more product of WPA, or not WPA, wartime regulations. So what do you guys think?
Well, that's an important thing to know, because it's just not something you would have thought about. I've never read about it like that.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
I'm really curious. I want to know when the switch occurs, because there's, in some of my writing and research, there's so much surplus commodity cotton during the darker days of the Depression before the war.
Yes.
And the government's intervening then too to try to get people to use
get
the
it out,
right?
Uh-huh.
And they actually encourage, you showed those burlap bags, a lot of the bags were made from jute and things like that were imported from overseas, and they wanted to switch to making the bags, the
from our cotton,
dual purpose, sacking from cotton, from the commodity cotton that's in use. And then they're promoting that to the women there were home economists teaching the women how to make stuff out of the cotton, and they have a surplus, and so
And then the surplus turned to a deficit.
Yeah, exactly.
So I would say 42. I think it started in 39 when we started rather secretly supplying Europe with things that we didn't want to talk about. But I would say 42 is when those laws started passing. So between 42 and on, it goes into the 50s, maybe into 55, where it's still hard to get cotton fabric. I mean, being born in 45, you couldn't get sugar when I was 5. I remember this. My mother was thrilled to get a package of Jell-O with all its sugar in it. So there were still shortages up into the 50s, but I would guess it happened in 42. And the thing is, the burlap came from foreign places, although we raised a lot of it here. But it had to go to the war effort. I'm sure they had many, many uses for burlap in war. So do remember that cotton is not just sweet and nice. It's a commodity that is very, very
it's a
important.
major commodity, and like so much of, I mean, I was very fascinated by, the trade organizations that are sponsored by the government. They're pushing cotton on women. And so hearing this account, it was just like, okay, we have like a switch that occurs at some
We have a
point.
switch.
And this is really fascinating. Yeah. And part that I,
and it's something that's not talked about because people don't want to talk about government regulation. That's unpopular. And so it's much more popular to say feed sacks sadness, feed sacks poverty, than feed sacks government regulation. But the government really was strong in this area and really dictated, in the 40s, what was available.
Well, I mean, it is a fascinating time period to study as a whole. I mean, the amount of, frankly, socialism that's taking place in like every sector, I mean, is astounding when we think about our rah-rah free trade capitalism era that we, that's the story of American exceptionalism that we all know is the capitalist side. And
that's Mr. Coolidge. Yeah, and that's how we got into that depression. But really, I mean, it was near socialism, and people were ready for it. And that's why we have more donkeys than elephants, Julie.
Totally, that's why we have more donkeys. Yeah. And that's why we have 100 planned communities across the United States that were government funded, basically communal, like living situations. I mean, this is,
and we can toss it under the rug because right now, the liberal mob is kind of down. People are down on it, but I always think of Eleanor as part of the liberal mob, and certainly FDR. I have to show back and behind me is my Roosevelt clock, and I also, what happened to Fred? I have one of my favorite possessions here is my Roosevelt cane from the 19 I'm going to put myself up here. I don't know how to do that. But here, anyway, it's a cane from the 1933 World's Fair. And here's Frank. Here's Frank. So I have quite a collection of Roosevelt stuff. And the reason is that father of mine, with his bottle of rye there, was very liberal New Yorker who trained me I was born after Roosevelt died. He and my mother were so enamored of the whole New Deal idea. And they didn't suffer like Lynn's family. There were no cows out there in Brooklyn, but they were so lucky to have jobs and their family. So anyway, we have talked a long time, kids, but we had a good time, didn't we?
We did.
So we will have
Thank you, Janneken, for coming. Thank you.
you.
Look forward
Very
to
good.
much for inviting me. It's lovely to see you all, and so thrilled to get to talk about this stuff with you.
Did you know you can watch our previous episodes on Vimeo? Vimeo.com/quiltdistrict/VOD_pages. Or you can search for the 6 Know-It-Alls when you go to the main page of Vimeo.com. You can also catch our first 3 episodes, which are free, on our YouTube channel. You can go directly to our YouTube channel, or you can go to youtube.com and search for the 6 Know-It-Alls. You can also find all the updates and links to previous episodes on quiltdistrict.com. Go to quiltdistrict.com and then the 6 Know-It-Alls tab, and there you'll find all the upcoming episode information, as well as the background on how the 6 Know-It-Alls got started and some biography information on all of the Know-It-Alls. You'll also want to be sure you put your email address in here so that you can get notified of upcoming events straight to your email inbox.
And I'm harping on this because lighting is so important to understanding the seasonal rhythms of quilting in this early period and why it began to change in the 19th century.
But that's not the way we use it, just to stick it in there. And so often you will find some turkey red pieces just put in there for a little flair. Even this one has a little bit of red down there, although that's a wool.
This is one quilt that I wanted to talk about today because we just were able to add it to the collection last year. Yeah, it was on loan for many years from the family. And some of you know the quilt maker Anna Catherine, known as Catherine Hummel Markey Garnhart of Frederick, Maryland. And thanks to my predecessor, Nancy Gibson, we now know of 10 quilts made by Markey Garnhart. And we now own 3.
Yeah. Yes. And that is very interesting that it's made for the wife of a minister. And I have never heard of the lady sewing group being called a circle of industry. So that's quite interesting. I wonder if it's belongs to that denomination, if there are others that call themselves something similar.
So I just wanted to show how the designs of these bed rugs relate to whole cloth quilt and other types of quilts. So here we have one of the foot bed rugs, and here we have a whole cloth quilt that was made by Olive Curtis Baker in Connecticut. And the stitching of this whole cloth quilt is basically pretty much the same idea as you see in the bed rug.
The thing is, and this goes back to Lynn too with the bed rugs. If we were looking at men's work, if we were looking at ceramics like graffiti plates or painted chests, we wouldn't be thinking of it as a hobby.